Hello, welcome to the new video. This is the video I haven't done for a while. Some of you who watched before may remember the Abzan Blink or the Abzan Scam. I used to play and did 3 or 4 5-0s before, but all of that was mostly in Yorion version of the deck. This is the first time I'm playing the deck with 60 cards, and I think I finally tweaked the 60 card version to the final cards, and I really like the build, and deck feels real great. And I just finished the list, and I played the 2 leagues with it, and the games were very exciting and very fun. And I just wanted to immediately do the video of the deck because I think it's really games were just so exciting to play, and I think it will be very fun to watch it and just to see the deck in action. This is not a regular scam deck you're uh, used to see. So there's a lot more blinking going on in this version. So we are playing 4 Molecules Rebirth, 2 Undying Evils, 4 Ephemerates, and 1 Touch of the Spirit Realm. We also have 4 Eldrami's Call in a deck, which enable to find the missing pieces, so it may be the grief for turn 3, discard or solitude to remove their creatures, or just finding some Tarmogoyfs or our one-offs as Eternal Witness and Skyclave Apparition, or maybe Grist. Just put it as a value engine and start making that tokens, plussing the grist and so on. So it's very difficult to get rid of it, and it can really provide a lot of value for this version. It's This version is really resilient. It's definitely hard to beat. It has very good late game grind, although um, you don't have any almost any card advantage, but card power is very high, and your top decks are very good, and every card almost in a deck is a 2 for 1, so it has a pretty decent late game grind and the game against most of the mid-range decks. Okay, so as you already know, this deck plays a lot of removals. We have access to 4 Prismatic Endings, 2 Fatal Pushes, some Grists, which can also be used as removal. We have one of Touch of the Spirit Realm, which can also be a great removal for Murktide, or it can also be used to blink your creature or opponent's creature or artifact. And we have 4 Dramis Call to find our griefs and solitudes, or maybe Skyclad Apparition. So really a lot of ways to get rid of our opponent's creatures. So it's a very good deck against creature decks. And okay, so to make it easier for us to finish game, we play 4 Tarmagos here, along with Griefs and Solitudes and some one-offs and Grist. So we play 4 Tutsis, 4 Grief, which can make our Goif really big very early, especially if we succeed to do the grief, undying or ephemerate grief turn 1. Turn 2 grief will just always be a very good play. Very good threat. So okay, so that's it. One of the biggest reasons to be in this color combination is of course a solitude and grief, and we splash green to gain access to Eldrami's Call, which is just pretty, very good card in this deck, and it's probably one of the best cards in this version. And we also have a Tarmogoyf, very aggressive early creature. We all know that the Grief Blade decks or Grief decks suffer from playing Grief turn 1 and then not applying enough pressure early to win game before our opponent succeeds to redraw some of the things they need. But when you follow the turn 1 Grief with the turn 2 Tarmogoyf, that is really going to end the game very soon, leaving opponent with very limited time to do anything. So it's a pretty good clock. Also, a reason to be in this colors is a grist. It's a very powerful card in a lot of matchups where you just play do the scam thing turn one, play Goy for Eldrami turn two, and then if you jam the grist to turn three, it's very hard for opponent to deal with a lot of opponents not playing Leyland Binding or Prismatic Ending to deal with Grist. So it's a very good threat in all in all kind of matchups. Okay, so uh, just let us look at the sideboard. We play four Dramis calls, so of course we play on sideboard some creatures, some one-off or more creatures that can be tutored with the Dramis call, and that is mm, one of those creatures is Orvar, of course, which we can use against creativity decks. Then Genet Magistrate, which we can use against Cascade decks, but also has use in some other matchups. Sanctifier and Vec, just very good against Rakdos, good against Murktide. It is very useful, definitely. And then 3 Endurance on the side as some more concrete and tutorable graveyard hate piece. Also some artifact enchantment hate, two Knights of Autumn, one Collector Offie, two Force of Vigors, so some of them are tutorable and creatures are tutorable, and Force of Vigors and just Knight of Autumn are really nice to have post board against decks that play Leyland Binding, especially it's just a body, 2-1 body that destroys the Leyland Binding. It's just very effective. Okay, so time to go on to the games, and we will check. We will check. I just played 2 leagues with the deck, and both of them finished the 3-2. But I think this deck is pretty hard to play, and I definitely did some mistakes, which uh, just a second. Okay, I definitely did some mistakes that led to me losing some of the games, and it's definitely could have had better score, but it's still decent. I think most of the games were very exciting, and we will now watch some of those. Okay, so this last league I played against Murktide opponent. So my I went turn 2 Johnny's Call, turn 3 Grief. They had the double bolt, but I had 2 ways to blink my grief, so I succeeded to discard their Murktide Regent, and my opponent was just left with Misty and the Tawara in hand. They played the Misty. Sorry, I will hide this for now. Okay, so they played the Misty and just left with Ottawara in hand, and I discarded all I could from their hands, so Murktide and the Bolt, and just I was ahead. I was a bit ahead in life total, so I was able to pressure them with 3-2 Menace Grief, and they had Shredder and some channelers without Delirium, so I was in a pretty good situation. And they didn't want to trade with Grief, and so they just decided they also gonna go trying to attack me. So I went for a drum is called finding me second solitude in hope I will find another land, and I did find it, and I was able to unfortunately had to give my opponent a lot of life, but most important thing was definitely to just kill this Murktide now and be safe from for the next turn. Okay, so at this point, my opponent still had the Tawara in hand, and they decided to bounce the Solitude. So probably in case they side on gained 3 life, probably wanted to try to do some top deck with iteration or bolt or something before I gain more life. But it was a pretty good play for me. I just was able to recast my Solitude, then cast the second Solitude, and the game was very over at this point. So game 2 against my Murktide opponent, I kept a decent hand for game 2. No scamming on turn 1 this game for me, but I had the Goif, the Endurance, Grief, all good cards for this matchup. So my opponent went a Bubble Shredder, which then enabled me to cast my Goif as a 2-3, so I can block the Ragavan and dodge the Bolt. And they also had the iteration to grow my Goif even more, and they attacked with both. I definitely had to go for. I didn't have to go for Ragavan block here, but I really wanted to do it. They had dressed down and killed my Goif, unfortunately, but I was able to play the Endurance, so I was still in a pretty decent situation. They did attack for 4 and play the Channeler, but as I played Endurance before, um, okay, so I played the Grief. I played the Grief, and my opponent had a pretty good turn, but I just wanted to. It was most important for me to survive the turn and try to top deck the white card. I did top deck the white card, which was ideal at this situation. So I was able to Solitude Ephemerate, kill both of their creatures, and still hold the Endurance. I decided to cast it immediately before they drew draw a counter spell or something, just play my land and pass the turn with the 2 blockers. I was at 4 life at this point. So I had to be careful. I went for Ephemerate again on the graveyard, tried to keep as far from Delirium as possible. My opponent goes for Bold Phase, leaving me putting in 1 life, making my Mercury Bird unusable. But they fail and sack the bubble before combat, which meant that they had to attack with DRC, so I just free blocked the DRC and kill it. I made another token with Grist, so I was just able to draw me 4 Solitude, try to dodge the second bolt, play the Solitude next turn, and then start gaining some life after that. Okay, so just played my Solitude immediately, plus my Grist, of course, then continue attacking and hoping to dodge the bolt until next turn. Okay, so other than their top deck bolt, I was in a pretty decent position. And after this attack, I was out of the bolt range and it was over for them. They weren't able to win anymore, so that was it. That was game 1 against a Murktide opponent. Now on to the game 2. Okay, so mulliganing to 6, keeping the Grief hand, uh, making my Grief a 4/3, discarding 2 of my opponent's cards. I decided to go for Heat and Ragavan at this position. My opponent played the island, and I went for Totsis. They didn't play Consider and Response, so I decided to discard it, Consider, leaving them with the Shredder and Counterspell in hand. And my Shredder had the Menace, so I was able to continue attacking. And my opponent had the Counterspell in hand, so after they fetched, they left with 1 mana, and I decided to immediately kill the DRC to make them unable to double block the Grief. So they just played their Shredder, left Counterspell in hand, but Counterspell was useless. So I just killed them with Grief, saved the touch in hand in case they had some removal or if I need to remove the second blocker. And that was it. That was game 1. Just scammed them with Grief and cleared the path for Grief for the rest of the game. Okay, so game 2 on the draw. Again, drawing the decent hand with the double Grief. I decided to... here is my opponent's hand. Unfortunately, they had the Pierce and the Heat, so I was unable to do the scam thing, but I decided to go to just discard the Murktide Regent, and that was the main thing I had to do here. So just discard the Murktide, prolong the game, make me able to Okay, so Grief died the first time, so it was time to play the Grief again. So discarded the second heat, discarded Dragon again. Unfortunately, they played my Goif, and I had to use my removal to kill their Goif. So I knew my opponent hand was just nothing at this point, just two lands. So I didn't pay mana for spell pierce, but I just killed my Goef and attacked for three, and I was in a decent situation. But my opponent drew into the Murktide Regent. I had a Solitude in hand, but needed a white card. I had to play my Grief, although I knew that um, they don't have much. They don't have anything in hand, just a land. But I needed to play it just to be able to attack and block Ragad. But I decided to go for attack, and my opponent top decked Ragavan for exactly 3 damage, and that was it. Okay, that was game 2. Um, had decent hand, lost anyway, but game 3 much easier, starting first with again Grief turn 1, discarding a bolt from my opponent's hand, which can kill my Grief, and then deciding to uh, remove the Ragavan, so leaving my opponent in hand with some Pierce, Shredder, and Bubble. I was able to cast Goif on turn 2 and start attacking with Grief, so it's a very powerful start for me. I wasn't sure at this point if I should kill the Shredder and then attack and just ditch the Solitude. I knew my opponent has Spell Pierce, but I played my Ephemerate anyway and made them use it. Um, my Gorf was 4-5 at this point, and I was able to attack them. So I just killed Regent. Unfortunately, had to put them on 13 life, but I was able to cast my Endurance. I did a small mistake by playing Endurance before combat, so my Goif attacked for 3 instead for 4 damage, but didn't matter in the end. Luckily, but it definitely was a small mistake. My opponent then played Steam Vents Consider, connived with their Shredder, and I was able to just I top decked the Prismatic Ending, attack them for 7, put them in a very bad spot and 1 life. Kind of impossible for them to deal with this, and that was it. My opponent conceded. Okay, that was the second game against Murktide. We will now watch first win, and then we'll watch the loss, which was a really crazy game. Really crazy game against Sky Breach. Okay, so the win was third win was against Mono White Death in Texas. I had a decent hand for this matchup. Had Solitude with some flicker spells. So I just wanted to wait for my opponent to play more creatures. So I just went for Solitude, Blink, end of their turn, and tried to remove the Archon and Talia. But When I played the Marquis Rebirth, my opponent played their own Solitude, exiling Leonin Relic Warden and killing my Solitude. So um, my opponent had the 0 cards in hand at this point, and I wanted to remove the Lion Sash because it can grow very quickly and it can reduce my Goif power and toughness. And at this point, I just had the Ephemerate and Jami's Call in hand, so I decided it's best to go for the Solitude, and I top decked the land, which ended up pretty good because I removed my opponent's Talia, and then I was able to use Ephemerate after my opponent used their Solitude, so ended up pretty good for me. I was left with Solitude on the field, and my opponent unable to cast a creature next turn. They had a sword, which could potentially be dangerous if I just don't. Both of these swords could be very dangerous if I just don't draw anything, but I drew into Jami's Call and I decided to take a bit of risk this turn and just play the Jami's Call twice. If they did some cheap creature this turn and equipped it with the Sword of Light and Shadow, it could potentially be a problem for me, but I decided to risk it anyway, and it paid off. So I got additional threat, Solitude in hand. My opponent didn't draw a creature this turn, so it was over for them. Okay, that was game one. Okay, game two had to mulligan. I kept a decent 6 cards with a prismatic ending, Goif to protect myself early. Also wanted to fetch as early as possible because they played the Leonin Arbiter. This was definitely a mistake. I found the forest turn two. I should have gone for a shock because they played the Field of Ruin and Ghost Quarter. So uh, I had only played 3 basics. Okay, so turn three, I decide to go for Eternal Witness and bring back a Prismatic Ending. Um, then just when my opponent used their Stoneforge Mystic, I decided to tutor for Solitude and kill both of their creatures. But again, my opponent had their own Solitude, so they were able to save their Stoneforge Mystic, equip the Sword of Light of Shadow, and at this point to I was forced to jump with Eternal Witness, and then on my turn played the both Goyfs to which can block the sword very good. So my opponent went for Solitude after touching him, and I was able to discard the other sword, which is very good because that sword would definitely kill me. Okay, and at this point, I had the crime punishment. I boarded this card in because of the punishment part, but crime part proved to be much better in this matchup. So um, my opponent had the Solitude in their graveyard, and I was able to revive their Solitude. And luckily, my opponent didn't use the Field of Ruin before, so I was able to bring their Solitude in, and I had the ending in hand to kill the sword. So I was able to start attacking with Goif and lowering their life total. But having two vials in hand and Castle of Ardenvale and play could potentially just make my Goif worthless. And because they can just jump it and play their game with vials. And also, just having their solitude on the field was kind of dangerous. But okay, so you see at this point, my opponent just can make a token with castle every turn to block my Goif. My opponent went for Ghost Quarter, and I did the solitude came in response. I didn't have to do it in response, but it wasn't very important. I just started attacking with both Goif and Solitude, and my opponent didn't have much at this point, just zero cards, just 11 and Relic Warden, and drew a land, which made their castle active. So they were able from this point to just start chomping the Goif every turn. I decided to trade with the other Solitude. I probably should have traded with this Solitude too before, and that costed me the game in the end. Okay, so my opponent play Archon, so I can't put Overgrown Tomb untapped in play, and at this point the game became a bit trickier. My opponent forgot to make their token before blockers phase, so they didn't block this turn. And unfortunately, my opponent top decked the Flicker Wisp, which then flickered their Solitude, which then killed my Goif. That was obviously a very good play for my opponent, and it made the game very, very hard for me. But I was at 39 lives, so I was definitely still in the game. And game lasted very long. They had at this point they had the Ganjo in hand. They didn't have any of these. They were on zero card at the time, and I was able to absorb some of the damage. Play my knight, which can then trade with Solitude. And try to wait for just wait for the another white source. Unfortunately, I found Overgrown Tomb at the point, not the Temple Gardens. I wasn't able to cast my Solitude with this 5 mana, but I had the Crime to cast their Solitude, which was fine, good enough at this point. So they just continue making the human tokens. I was definitely in an unfavorable position. So I had to shock in a Temple Garden to be able to hold my second Solitude. My opponent put Blast Zone on 5, which complicated stuff a bit for me. And I also went to block the Stoneforge, so they were able to just blink it without me getting any life. And I went to Eldramis to find another Solitude. And when I tried to attack with this Solitude, my opponent decided to crack the Blast Zone and kill my Solitude before I gained the 3 life. They could have waited. They knew I found another Solitude. They could have waited until I play my second Solitude, exile their creature, let me gain some life, and then kill both of my Solitudes, but they decided against it. So I was just able to block one of the tokens and survive on one life with another solitude in hand. So I decided to go for the attack and decided to take the trades and then um, make them attack again and gain some more life, kill two more creatures. Okay, so I was still at a pretty decent position this game. Uh, Still winnable for me, but my opponent, I again did the same mistake, blocked the Mystic. I should have gone for the token block so they wouldn't blink it, and I would be at high life total. So my opponent was able to play some more of these small creatures, and that was it. So I was unable to make my solitude survive, and I lost the game 2. Game 3 was very quick. My opponent was very low on clock, and they just weren't able to find colored mana on time. And when I showed them on the Night of Autumn, they conceded the game. I played Goif turn 2. Um, they played the second land. When I showed them the Night of Autumn to kill their wild, they conceded the game. That was it. Okay, so we will now check out the loss. I think this was the Sky Breach matchup. It was pretty crazy. Okay, so playing first, going for Totsis. Turn 1, I decided to immediately discard the breach, leaving my opponent with two Ragavans, Emery, some artifacts in hand. I went for Glyph at turn 2 to be able to block the Ragavan. They, of course, used the Spell Bomb and replayed their Emery, and I had a good hand. I was able to kill both Emery and the first Ragavan. So at this point, my opponent was in a very bad situation, but they top decked the expressive iteration, and I was able to just start attacking with Solitude and play my Tarmogoyf, and my opponent killed my Solitude. So I can gain life. They went for another expressive iteration and the Ragavan off of it. I drew a tap land, so I went for second Goif. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to use the or push or solitude on my opponent's Ragavan in response to this Underworld Breach, so my opponent was able to kill both of my Goifs, and they also had one more Ragavan in hand. So I was left in the pretty bad situation at this point. They had two creatures in hand. I had Marcus Rebirth and Solitude, and they even got the kill the same turn. And I was in a pretty very good position at one point. And this second game, I was even better position. I was so far ahead. I was sure I'm going to win this, but my opponent just kept on drawing some solutions uh, to make him survive. So my Griff was too small in this turn, so I decided to go for the Tutsis and the removal for Ragavan for this turn. So they were left with Urza Saga, Urza, Unholy Heat, another Ragavan in hand. Yeah. I had I had Goif for the next turn, which can block this Ragavan, but they top decked the Emery and they were able to play both Emery and Urza this turn. Okay, so I pushed the third Ragavan, and at this point I knew about their heat in hand, but they didn't have the lithium, so they were unable to kill my Tarmogoyf. They use push heat on the knight. My opponent played the Underworld Breach, and I scammed the Endurance in response, making their breach irrelevant. Okay, so I decided to even go punishment to kill the Mox Umber, make my opponent unable to use the Urza ability next turn. So I just exiled the Urza, attacked with the Tarmogoyf, putting my opponent on 2 life. The Skyclad apparition wasn't very efficient. My opponent drew into one blocker, into second blocker, into third blocker, and I was on low life too, so I had to be careful. I pushed one of their creatures and then attacked again. Then my opponent plays Teferi. I bounced my Goyf. I had Knight of, again, a very good play, Knight of Autumn into the Fable, kill Fable. So um, I drew very well. I decided to go for the face, try to make a kill next turn with attacking with both creatures. My opponent plus the Teferi and unfortunately top deck into the Underworld Breach, killing both of my creatures. It was possibly the only thing they could have top deck to survive the turn. So I just played my Goif, which they must block at this point, and but I decide to prismatic ending the Kikijiki and play my Goif. It was a riskier play, and my opponent just top decked second or third second to fairy and killed me with a large construct token. If they didn't have the solution for this one turn, they would be forced to jump with this construct token, and that was it. Okay, so two really crazy games, which I was very sure I was going to win easily, and then I lost. Okay, so the second loss this league was um, against Mill. It wasn't that interesting, so we'll rather go watch another league. Okay, so let me just check which league is it. Mm, okay, I think it's this one. Okay, this game one was definitely one of the craziest games I played with this deck. Okay, so turn one, I kept six very good cards. I went for Godless Shrine turn one, Scam Grief immediately, exile the Tutsis, played first look at their hand, see what they got, exile the Fire Ice, then Marcus Rebirth, save Ephemerate, a touch for the next turn, then exile their Ephemerate in case they They draw the Blink Elemental. Okay, so I started attacking with Grist. Then I found I played it first Totsis, then Ephemerate on their draw step, exile their second omelet, and then on my turn Vesuvian Diplomacy. I kept the touch of the Spirit Realm in hand with the Drummy Skull and continued to attack my opponent. At this point, my opponent had just lands in hand, and I decided to go for Drummies, and then my opponent used the situation to kill my grief, but it was fine because I just found my Goif, which makes a pretty good clock. I went for witness this turn, making it lethal on board state for the next turn, and my opponent concedes. Okay, so the game one was the easiest. Kept a hand with some Totsis, the drum is cool, possibly doing the scam thing on turn 3. Okay, so I discarded the Blossoming Calm on turn 1 because I had another Totsis. And I played another Totsis. My opponent revealed Eldrami's Call plus Subtleties. I was unable to go for the Grief while they have the Subtlety, so I just let them play the Risen Reef and then use the Prismatic Ending on my turn and then try to use the Grief later. It was most important for me to get rid of this Risen Reef, and my opponent played a Fairy, which wasn't very ideal. But I had solution. I have solutions for that kind of thing. At this point, I just decide to go for the grief. They decided not to use the subtlety on my grief. They just played their omelet, then top decked into fury, which dished the harbinger to kill my grief. I was unable to save my grief from dying, then kill their Teferi with menace and plus and destroy my grist to kill their omelet. And at this point, my opponent was left with 0 cards in hand, and I was able to kill their final threat, Fury, with my Solitude. And at this point, we both were in top deck mode, and game lasted really long until we had like 0 cards in hand. Okay, so there was no point of ephemerating at this point. I was in a slight advantage. I had Solitude on the board and attacking for 3 with lifelink. I return with 1 prismatic ending in hand, but my opponent plays a lot of strong cards like Omnat, which can make that advantage irrelevant. So my opponent, I discarded the Ephemerate. On my turn, my opponent went to cast the Vesuvian Diplomacy, and I continued attacking. I had my Tarmogoyf, and I decided to risk it and attack with both of my creatures. In case they don't find the binding, they will be forced to block to jump with Omnat, and I would succeed to pass the 3 damage. So at this point, I saved the fetch from earlier, and I was able to kill the Omnat with my fatal push, and still had the ending in hand for the Rising Reef, but they did a lot of these plays, which uh, all of their cards just replace one another. They redraw a lot of cards with them, and but still, they uh, they played Blossoming Calm on my Grief, but they were just on one life and didn't have anything great at this point. I also were struggling to find some more threats to finish this game. Just one sorry ephemerate in hand. Mm, I did find this Skyclave apparition. I decided to play my apparition, but decided not to use it on Vesuvian duplicate because it would give them the 4/4 the token, which could possibly end the game very quickly. And they went for Solitude, so I saved my Skyclave apparitions a bit because I wanted to trade with Solitude and definitely didn't want to give them a 4/4 token. And I decided against removing Vesuvian diplomacy. Okay, so uh, I used a lot of fetches, so I had a lot of lands on the field, and so at this point, most of my draws are non-lands and decent. So uh, I I drew pretty well. Solitude into Thermoglyph. I was able to threaten them with Thermoglyph, which which is I think just definitely a very good threat in this build in this deck, and they also had Solitude to deal with it, but at least I removed their Solitude. But it was just a battle of removal. Both players had abundant removal, and I just used another fetch to lower the amount of lands in the rest of my deck, and it was just definitely cripple fight at this point. Um, uh, Both players with no threats on the field, just passing turns. Um, it's definitely what happens in a lot of these scam matches in this Abzan version. uh, and it's part of the reason why the deck is that hard to play because it just my opponent I discarded the ephemera that they had left momentary blink in hand, which was very scary with Vesuvian diplomacy in hand, and I just continued exiling their threats, just exiled the Teferi, but I was in a worse position at this point, just waiting for them to find the last Re for Omnat, and they did find the Harbinger, and they saved the fetch and the momentary blink in hand for the next turn when they draw the Omnat. I didn't have much, just Ephemerate and Mercury Rebirth at this point, and they were able to at last start using the Vesuvian diplomacy, and they made a token of Omnat, which then made some damage to me. but I was able to find another solitude. I was able to find another solitude to kill both of their opponents, and they were left with just 6 cards in hand at this point, and they find 5 cards, and they find the Fire Ice, and Fire Ice finished the game before I gained life from their solitude. Okay, so that was it. Sorry, that was that game 1? I can't remember. Just a second, we will check it. No, we just watched this. This was the game 2, sorry. And now it's time to check out the game 3. I get sometimes a bit lost with these games. Okay, so I had a pretty good hand in game 3. I went for the grief turn 1. My opponent tried to use the solitude, but you just really never do that. You can do that. It's pretty bad decision from my opponent, and they just lose everything. After that decision, they were just left with 1 card in hand and 2 lands on the field. Everything was discarded, everything they have, and I was left with grief on the field and grift in hand, which was a pretty good position for me. And once you start in this position after scamming grief, when you start passing the grist, it's almost impossible for these 4-color decks to get back into the game unless they drew the perfectly like Leyland Binding into more gas. Okay, so I discarded the binding and start making some more tokens, and my opponent conceded. So that was game 1 of this second league, and this was the loss. I will just play 2 more of these wins and then finish this video. And it would be too long if I showed if I would show all the matches. Okay, so in this match, keeping mediocre starting hand, but having Goif makes it usable, and also Solitude plus Rebirth could potentially means that just one white card away from scamming Solitude, which can be pretty devastating play against a lot of the decks. So it's worth it to keep that kind of hand. After their exiling my Ephemerate and playing Croxa, um, my opponent just had a hand full of lands, and they played Vren, and I decided to go attack Vren. They had Croxa in the graveyard. Croxa is very good. Croxa was just a very good threat in this matchup, and my opponent cast Solo the Windgrace. Cast Solo of Windgrace, and I don't know what happened. I just brain farted at this point. I wanted to I wanted to use the I hoped to just use the undying evil in the combat, and after the combat I just entirely skipped my second main phase and didn't play touch the spirit realm into the soul of Windgrace, which then made possible for my opponent to gain a lot of life with the soul on their next turn, which then enabled them to survive one more turn. So complicated my position. Definitely, I went from decent position into very bad, just waiting for them to cast Groxa and discard my lands. I decided against playing the Totsis or anything. I just holded Undying Evil. Okay, so I discarded Totsis. They plus the Vren on 8 counters, drew some more cards. They had Nihil Spellbomb on the field, plus Croxa, and I drew into Ephemerate. So I was just able to continue attacking with Grief with Menace, and I was holding Ephemerate and Undying Evil in hand. So my opponent attacks with Croxa, and I again. What happened at this point? Show chat, show log. No, not chat. I need game log. Okay. Ah, yeah. Uh, I didn't draw into anything, and I was forced to quit this game. But I should really just played the Undying Evil on my Tarmogoyf. Or maybe go when they attacked. I should have gone with Ephemerate first, and then after their lightning bolt, I should have then gone the Undying Evil, and then lose 3 life for Croxa attack. That would have been better, but I managed to win after, so it was fine. But it definitely wasn't the perfect play. Okay, so I didn't have untapped Black Source game one, so I had to play a Molecular Bird, and turn one just wait for another black card and another blink effect, and so game two, I just turn two I just went for Tarmogoyf, which was already pretty large, 4/5. Uh, Hold the Wheel of Summer, Prismatic Ending, wait until I get mana to cast my Grief. Okay, so my opponent already at 7. Already 7. Goif doing a decent job. And they went for a jump on block with Goif, and I was able to find another Goif. They did find the Nihil Spellbomb, but Nihil Spellbomb couldn't deal with both graveyards, and they were on 7 life. And even if they exiled the graveyard, Koif will still be large enough to make them unable to survive, and that was game 2. So we'll now watch the game tree. Okay, so again, keeping a pretty decent hand, having in that triumph, unfortunately turn one, so no untapped black swords. I had to wait for another turn before trying to scam. And my opponent had a bolt, but I was able to use the molecular rebirth, and my opponent didn't have the red mana at the moment, and I decided to just uh, discard the fatal push, and I needed the third land to kill the Urza Saga, but it didn't happen, so I just had to be happy with using my Knight of Autumn next turn. They play the Springer Drum, which would make them able to use red mana next turn, so I just destroy the drum, I leave the constructs alone, and just attack them with Grief. They still didn't have the red mana to cast the Fable from their hand, and I drew into Tarmogoyf, which was pretty great as I already had the prismatic ending from before, which meant I have I'm able to go um, prismatic ending in Goyf. Next turn, I decide to discard the Fable, leave the Endurance in their hand, and this time I attack with everything, expecting them to play endurance on the attack, and I wait for them until they play the endurance to shrink their goif. So after that, I exile their goif, giving them just 2 life and making them survive. And that was it. They didn't have the out after that. They died with 2 unknown cards in their hand. That was the Jund Saga matchup, and we will watch one more game. We'll watch one more game, and that will be all the wins from the 2 leagues. As I said, both leagues I finished 3-2, but some of the games I lost was due to some misplays I made, and that's why I decided just to show the most interesting loss. And I think this deck feels really powerful, as you can see, and a lot of these hard matchups. I just was able to outgrind my opponents with all these hard matchups like 4-color Omnat piles, like 2-3 Murktide decks, and all other really just bunch of really top tier decks. And my opponent went for Shardless turn 3 into Glimpse, finding them 2 lands and a Seasoned Pyromancer. And they were on 12, and I had a decent luck. They decide to let damage through, and didn't draw anything, so they concede on their turn. Okay, that was game 1, just scamming them turn 1 with Grief, and finishing them with bigger Grief and Thermoglyph. Okay, so my opponent did succeed to play the Shardless Agent, but I exiled all their permanents in the meantime, and they were just able to get three permanents from the Cascade, and it wasn't enough to win the game. Okay, so game 2. I went for the second Tutsis. I discarded Wave Shifter and Chancellor, and they were left with just some lands in hand. Nothing special, but it was kind of enough. I even used my solid to kill both of their tokens in case they draw the cascade. They can't do it for a whole lot. They drew into some more lands, and I was able to play my grist, make some tokens, start attacking them. My opponent was still on a 90 life, so I got plenty of chances to draw the one more cascade. In meantime, I discarded the ley line of sanctity and continued attacking them. So they were just left with Bosseggio in hand at this point, so they just played Bosseggio and did find the Charles agent. Charles agent find glimpse, which then find my opponent omniscience with wave shifter on the field. They drew into Chancellor and the ley line, so I had to jump a few of these tokens, and I decided to plus my grist, start making some blockers, and start making some chances. Obviously, my opponent resolving omniscience or whatever it's called. I had a very awkward hand at this point. My opponent found the Season Pyromancer for the top and hardcasted the Emrakul, and that was enough for me, so I conceded. Okay, so game 3, again planning on trying to scam my opponent, of course. I had the grief thing at turn 1, and my opponent mulliganed to 5 cards with Gemstone Caverns played turn 1. So I just used I used the grief turn 1, discarding both cards from their hand, both Outburst and Agent, so leaving them with just one Sokenzan on my turn 1. Okay, so pretty ideal. And unfortunately, didn't have a second land. I did have it, but I played Malacry's Bird, so I wasn't able to cast my Goyf. But I had the Solitude, I had the Endurance, and I did find the land a bit later to cast my Goyf and fasten the clock. And my opponent, same as me, was struggling with lands, but I had two very good threats on the field, and I wanted to cast Maldrami to find a black card to cast Grief this turn. My opponent forced that, but they didn't find anything and didn't find the third land, and that was it. Okay, that was all the games, all the wins from last two leagues. I showed the one defeat, which was the most interesting. Um I think the deck has some incredible potential. I think it feels very powerful while playing it. I lost some of the games because it was the first time me playing it in a long time, and just missed some experience with it and missed some maybe wrong sideboard choices in the few matchups, and it were just small details, but they led to some very long and close games, and they led to my defeat in those few games. But it were really close, and none of the matchups. And, none deck can go easily through this deck and win without any trouble. So I think it feels really powerful. I used to play this deck with Stoneforge Mystic, but I think with printing of Leyline Binding, uh, Kalja, it's now very easier to solve with March, the other worldly light, prismatic ending, now Leyland binding. It's just too many answers for Kalja, and I play Grief and Totsis into main. I'm already into green with the Jamis, with Grist, and I decide I want to play Golf as my early threat and the fastest beater. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the sideboard. I'm pretty happy with the list. I think it's. I think it's. I played similar versions before. I think I perfected the 60 card version of this deck with this list. I think it is the strongest I have tried so far, and that's it. I hope you like it. Subscribe to the channel for some more videos in the future, and that's it for now. Okay, goodbye.